Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 5, How to Obtain and Use Online Data. So while learning to use ArcMap and do GIS is important in the sense of learning how to use the software and know what all the tools and toolbars means, etc., it's also very critical to know where your data comes from, because as much as you can understand and learn how to work with software, you're not going to be able to do anything without having some data. And in the real world, as these things go, you don't get data packaged up for you in for a lab like we do with our current textbook. You actually have to find your own information, and this makes it infinitely more complex. So it's really important to have an understanding of where this information comes from and how you can access it, and also to not be intimidated by it, because it's actually very interesting, pretty easy to use. You just have to sort of get some practice using it. There are many sources of geospatial data that are free and relatively easy to use, as I said. We have the national map, which we'll be using quite a bit throughout the rest of this textbook. We have digital line graphs that come from the USGS, as well as digital raster graphics. The US Census Bureau offers their information in a GIS format. There's also something called the National Land Cover Database, which we will get into in later chapters. And then there's also other sources known as VGI, which I've mentioned before, Voluntary Geographic Information, as well as ArcGIS Online, which you have, I think, already gone over with your labs, where you can access the online information and pull it into your desktop system. Okay, so the next few slides, I'm just going to talk briefly about each of these major sources of online data. The national map, as I mentioned before, is really important for doing GIS analyses. There's just so much information you can find. So it's good to start there when you're looking at doing a research project. So this is actually funded by the National Geospatial Program. All the information is free, and all of the information is in vector or raster format. And you can look at the different types of data you can access are about transportation, structures, boundaries, lakes and rivers, also known as hydrography, geographic names, historic topo maps. The National Land Cover Database, which I mentioned before, is actually separate, but it's linked to the national map. Contour lines, LiDAR data, orthoimagery, and 3D elevation files. Now some of this might all sound a little more advanced, and it is, but you do have access to it, and over time you'll learn how to use these different types of data sets. So the USGS, or the United States Geological Survey, has their information in GIS formats in the form of digital line graphs or digital raster graphics. Digital line graphs, also DLG for short, are topo maps that actually have their contour lines as digitized features, so you can use that data, you can actually manipulate that data and use the information, as opposed to topo maps that have just been scanned and georeferenced, so you can use them more as like a base map kind of, but they cannot be analyzed further. They're static images. The Census Bureau puts their information in what's called Tiger line graph data sets, and is topologically integrated so that you can actually do a variety of GIS analyses with it. But the important thing about this, the Census Bureau information is that demographic data is connected to these tiger lines that include these county borders, census blocks, and block groups, which if you haven't worked with census data before, well, that'll become more evident. I think we actually do some more work with census data in following chapters. But it can be a very, very rich source of demographic data. So if you're doing anything that deals with populations or different subgroups, then this is the place to turn to. So VGI, or Volunteer Geographic Information, again, I know we've discussed this briefly, but it's essentially crowdsourcing geospatial data. So examples that deal strictly with maps are OpenStreetMap and Wikimapia, where users go in and make edits to maps. So it's anybody within an editor role on OpenStreetMap can go in and make changes or suggest edits. But there's other things that are considered VGI, such as uploading geotagged photos to Flickr, uploading photos of your meal at a restaurant to Google or Yelp, or taking pictures of graffiti and uploading it to a citizen reporting app, these are considered VGI because anytime you take that photo, becomes tagged with a coordinate, set of coordinates from where you took that picture. So we know exactly where it happened, and it'll also have a time log. It'll have your profile associated with it, possibly, not necessarily, but there's a lot of information that can come along with that imagery that has a geospatial tag connected to it. So there's actually a lot of old geospatial data out there. And when I say old, I mean there's very old geospatial data, old maps that have been scanned, but there's also data from like the last 20 years, 30 years that is in different file formats. It was about 10 or 15 years ago, I believe, that Esri changed the way it actually uses the information, that the data, the point raster polygon files were actually what were called shape files. So sometimes stuff is still in that format, and you still need to use it even if it's older data, because sometimes that's the only way it exists. Fortunately, Esri has a way of working with all of that information. It's called data interoperability tools. So if you ever come across something that doesn't look familiar, chances are you will still be able to work with it on ArcMap. So with this slide, I just wanted to give you an idea of how ArcMap and ArcGIS Online play together. Right now we're moving through a few sections or chapters where we're learning about different kinds of data, we're learning about online data, we're learning about how to access online data through your desktop ArcMap system. And we've done a little bit last week where we published information from desktop onto ArcGIS Online. But I also wanted to make sure you understood that you can actually move information from ArcGIS Online into ArcMap. So if you find that there's information that you'd rather be working with on desktop, it is possible to bring those two together. This is especially good if you have online data that you've accessed, such as some VGI or other information that maybe you found through some back channels and you're only getting it through the internet. You can put it into a feature service on an ArcGIS Online map and publish it back into your desktop. So just to give you an overview of how this looks, you can see that on ArcMap we can publish information from the desktop onto ArcGIS Online using a map package or a service. But going the other direction, we have this sort of hierarchical system. We have data layers that include feature services and tiled map services. These can then be published either as a layer package or pushed over into ArcMap individually. But we can also do this with tools. So we haven't gone a lot into tools or geoprocessing yet, but these are just tools or individual tools, so to speak, for doing one certain thing, such as processing a raster graphic for a certain function, versus a geoprocessing package, which is taking a whole series of tools and using those together to actually have a specific outcome for your project. That's called a geoprocessing package. You can publish those back into ArcMap. And I have applications in black up there on the upper right because it's only on ArcGIS Online that you can create applications, of course, using all of this information. Okay, and just a little bit on metadata. The end of chapter 5, there's a small section on metadata. This isn't something we have to be too concerned with, especially at these beginning stages in learning GIS, but metadata is important in that this is how you will verify the veracity of the information you're dealing with. So if you were actually working on a project for a company, or even if you're doing a master's degree, or if you're doing a final project in a big GIS program, you want to know that the data you have comes from a reputable source. So like any research project, your citations have to come not just from Wikipedia or from the local newspaper, they have to actually be from sources that have been vetted, that are published by academic journals that have verification systems and whatnot. This is essentially ensuring that the information you've gotten is accurate and is following certain guidelines for publication. There's actually federal standards for doing this, and there's also international standards. So metadata is also a good place to turn to for information about projections and measurements and what exactly the author of the data was intending the data to be used for. So if you ever open up a file, you can click on the metadata just to get an idea of what's going on in the background. Again, not critical for what you do at this juncture, but it's good to know. So this is just a little more information on metadata. I won't go over it. You can read it if you want in more detail. So last but not least, what this is all building towards and what I want to just introduce briefly is I want you to start thinking about a project. So in chapter 4, we learned how to move geospatial data from desktop to ArcGIS Online. We also learned about ArcGIS Online. This week we're learning about major sources of free accessible geospatial data. And next week we'll actually start learning about creating your own geospatial data. So what this is leading to is having you start thinking a little more critically about what you could be doing for a project. And this isn't to say this is a project you're actually going to do. I just want you to start thinking about applying what we're learning in this class to what it is you do, whether it's what you study, what you do as in your profession, or what it is you're just very interested in. If you're interested in, bird migration and bird habitats as you're a bird watcher, then this is a perfect thing to work with in a GIS. So just start thinking about, based upon what you've learned and what it is you do, how can we use GIS? And think big picture. I don't want you to be constrained necessarily by thinking how it can actually be realized. I just want you to be able to think about applying GIS to what you do. So given that, I will end this now and have a great week.